Okay, in the 1860s, there's this guy named Charles Barg, and another guy, Jerome, Jerome is pretty well known for his paintings and drawings. Barg is best known for this. Not this exactly, but he worked with Jerome, who had an atelier, which is basically just a traditional art school. It's like an art academy. And they set up this, basically a booklet that they would give students. It has 100 and something. This is missing some of them, some of the master studies, but 187 altogether, basically like this, that the students would have to go through to do the course, so they had to copy all of these things. This is still taught today, or rather used today by more traditional schools. I've drawn pretty much all of these, so that's why we have the Beethoven one. It's the same idea, but it's not actually in this book. But they'd move from, like the foot at different angles, to the hands, to large casts. And a lot of these are historic images or historic casts that were laying around, which is kind of cool. I'm trying to look for one that I remember. I think this is a pope of some kind. Busts are the most. There's a Marcus Agrippa. I think that might be Brutus. That was a queen of some kind, I can't remember which one. Anne, just an infant. A war horse of some kind. Oh, that's Marcus Agrippa. So yeah, they'd work through all these, and that was kind of the first chunk of like a basic drawing class kind of for them, obviously super accelerated. And then they would be able to move on to drawing from life after they kind of conquered that. Historically, which is really interesting, Vincent van Gogh found the book or a booklet that was left, and he went through the whole program, and Picasso did too. One of the ways we know so much now about the book is because of Van Gogh's letters to his brother. He would kind of talk about that. What's really interesting, actually, is one of these images. This one. You might have seen before, because it's a pretty famous one. Back in the 1860s and into the early 1900s, this was a really, really famous cast. And what they used to do is, you'd buy sculpture, you'd visit France. This is, both Jerome and Barg were French artists. You'd visit France and you'd buy like an Eiffel Tower, little trinket thing. And a lot of people would buy this bust, and there was this guy who would sell basically these souvenirs, and this bust was allegedly supposed to be of a young girl who drowned. I think she had a whole story about it was like a Romeo Juliet kind of story, and she threw herself off a bridge and drowned in the river, and that kind of sparked this whole intrigue about her, and people kind of became obsessed with this image, so much so that it's all made up, because one guy was kind of trying to pitch, to move these more and more, but people became obsessed with this image, and a lot of artists had it hung up in their studios. And eventually the guy who made the mannequin for the first CPR dummy used this young girl's image for the kind of face of it. And one of the practices during the early CPR days was to ask the dummy if it was okay. And the dummy's name at the time was Annie. So the Michael Jackson song comes from Annie, are you okay? Which is what they used to ask CPR dummies, which is what this was based off of. So it's a really weird history of that. The Beethoven death mask is what they used to do, often for historical figures or important figures, is they would, when they passed, they would put wax over their faces or plaster and cast their face, so, and then remove that, cast that, so they had, you know, a replica of their face, so that any artists, sculptors, painters, anyone who's going to make a image of them had reference to use. So Beethoven's cast is a pretty famous one. I think there's one of like George Washington. There might be an Abraham Lincoln one. There's a ton of really famous people that you can kind of see their cast. They're not the best quality because obviously if it's a dead person and you're weighing their face down with plaster, their face is kind of distorted a little bit. But Beethoven's one is pretty cool.
Are they actually cast somewhere, like at a museum or something?
Yeah, you can find the actual casts at museums floating around. Madame Tussauds, the famous wax museum now, that was kind of what she would do in her beginning of her career and kind of throughout. She's well known for doing the casts of people. And that's kind of where, you know, her full-sized figures come from now, is that tradition of capturing a famous person to make it easier for basically other people to kind of see them. Now obviously it's not dead people, but it used to be. And the Beethoven one's been passed around so much that you probably, like anyone that you get from it is probably from the lineage of that first original one. People might have resculpted it, but just interesting historical kind of fact about that. So we're going to go about this the same way. Actually, it's probably going to be easier with the skewer. The same way that we usually block in things. And we're going to do this 2 times the size, so doubling all of our measurements. Obviously, I'm going to start here. Historically, these were supposed to be done in charcoal too. Nowadays, they're kind of done in graphite a lot, but they were kind of purposely supposed to be done in charcoal. I might move that down, but that should be fine. And just like the first shapes that I had you guys do, let's see. It'll be helpful for you to break things down into the basic lines, the basic shapes of things, before you start worrying too much about all the individual details. Just kind of some marks of where things start and stop, and then the basic shapes of stuff. So don't even worry about the detail of this eye. It's kind of all one shape right there. Same thing, pretty much just tracing these boundary lines is all you really need to focus on in the beginning. This is a good, for almost everyone who said, excuse me, that they focus too much on detail. This is going to be a good practice of restraint. Also, drawing faces. Sometimes people are like, oh, well, anatomy is kind of accelerated for basic drawing class. Don't worry about anatomy. You're not even trying to think about, you don't need to know what's underneath all this stuff. You're just focusing on shapes, just thinking of that abstractly in your mind. Because if you start thinking about, this is an eye, and you draw something, and you're like, your mind is going to tell you that doesn't look like an eye. Because a lot of these shapes are really weird and really subtle. And you probably kind of want to make a little more resolution to it, resolve them a little bit more. don't kind of fight back with that. There's a limited amount of information, and that's all you need to copy. We're focusing on the subtlety of things and developing that. So when your brain starts to inevitably tell you, that doesn't look like an eye, that doesn't look like a nose, that doesn't look like a face, kind of push that back a little bit more, because inevitably it will say that. And I wanted to. It's going to be. These are your handouts, so you can draw on them if you want to. I find that's probably going to be a little easier. Again, the boundaries here. There's also tape up here. I find it easiest to be able to tape it kind of right next to it this way, so you can look across like this. Looking up, this is kind of like the most natural movement for you to look this way. Looking up or looking down, it's amazing how much your brain will forget in that little subtle movement. And looking side to side just kind of minimizes how much you're losing. You'll still have, be able to see your drawing when you're looking at this, and you'll still be able to see your reference when you're looking at your drawing. I'll draw this in. So, okay, again, the marble kind of block that we're going to start with, and then start chiseling in from there. So I think this corner would be a good spot to start, because it's pretty easy to chisel this out. When I'm looking at this, there's some subtlety in what the line is doing right here. I'm not going to worry too much about that, and I'm just going to kind of do one or two straight lines right there, and then one going here. I can always go into that later on, and you can even see, because this is actually a drawing that I previously did, you can see the outline of some of these shapes where I've corralled them back in, right there and right there. So kind of overestimating what's going on here, and then taking the eraser and actually chiseling that in with the eraser to fix that shape is a really easy way to kind of get these super subtle undulations and a longer line. And it's a little more accurate, because if you try to draw these exactly, it's going to be very heavy-handed with kind of detail in your line work. So I think the first thing that would be easy is where this cheekbone kind of meets the edge of this line that I've drawn, measuring from here to here, from the very bottom to that cheekbone. Got one, got two. So that's, and if I look across, that's pretty much the eye line. It's like the eyelashes right there. So, I'm just going to draw across with that. So I know from here to here to here is going to be, all this information in here. What's going to be easiest, I think, is then going from this corner, measuring to that bottom part of the kind of chin. One, two. And then measuring from this part of the chin to here. So now I have that chin pretty well blocked in. If I draw a straight line from here to here, and then from here to here, we have a super basic rendering of here to here and then here to here. I like to start kind of with that, because I'm not committing to any, especially with the vine charcoal, I'm not committing to really anything with that. I'm just kind of getting my bearings, basically. I'm putting something down so I can correct it later on, and that already is quite a bit of information. From, I have the eye line down, I have this whole side of the chin, or cheek and chin. So now you can reference this going forward where the nose line might be, or the bottom of the nose rather, might be the best place to start. Next. 1, 2. It's going to be somewhere in there. 1, 2. So it looks like it should start here. Oh wait, did I measure off of here? Yeah, looks fine. And I already have that eye line, so I know it moves up to here. Goes a little past the eye line. Into the brow slightly. And I'll just trace kind of that shape, these basic shapes going around. I'd probably combat like this side just to get this in a little bit more, the basic shape of this, and then measuring in to get all these things. There's no way you're going to be able to measure even like what's going on in here. You'll have to use the techniques that we used for the bag, the eraser, and then kind of smudging into areas to get all the stuff that's going on in here. Because it's going to be really hard to, 1, pinpoint, and 2, even measure where these boundaries are in here. So I wouldn't even necessarily bother unless you're double checking. Well, it starts about here. I can measure generally from here to here. 1, 2. I should probably end around there. You might be able to get these, pick up these kind of shapes that are a little bit harsher more, and blocking in your dark value shapes. What I expect us to work on today is just really focusing on those dark boundaries, our shadow shapes, and then our light shapes kind of in here. You can summarize this area, almost block all of this into your dark. And then as you move forward, you'll just darken this area more and more to build up this dark, and you'll darken these really deep shadows more and more to build up those. So it'll be kind of the same measuring system and everything that we've already learned, just on a more complex, subtle shape. So we'll see where we get at the end to the end of today. We'll have the same amount of time to work on this as we've worked on the other projects. It is going to be a lot more kind of finesse than some of the other ones, but I have confidence in y'all that they will turn out well based on our last project that we just did. So don't freak out too much. It is a ton of information. Think of it more simply as just looking at the shapes, just looking at the light and dark shapes and working from there. You don't need to get any details in right away, so don't worry about that. Just getting in the large shapes. Yeah, and I'll work on that while you guys do too. Like I said, there's tape up here too for you to. What about that? You can skip the page. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. Oh, you can skip the pages too. I mean, we would probably fill out the whole sketchbook. So you're totally fine just picking the pages. I don't know if it'll be that big of a deal, but yeah, it's probably. Yeah, I mean, you'll be surprised by how much your measurements feel off compared to what you're kind of trying to interpret in it. As long as you're measuring and keeping to that, you're good. Yeah, you're ready to decide that. It looks kind of weird. And as you lock in things, you might say, oh, okay, my measurements were wrong. Yeah, don't worry too much about that. I think this is probably about as far as I'll go for the block end. The next step would be putting in, the darker values. I'm not going to do that right now. I think it'll probably be getting a little too far ahead. But some of these areas I've just kind of added lines to, like in here in the more subtle areas, just so that I'm kind of place holding for some shapes. I don't want to be get too lost in the exact shape, but I also don't want to, forget that there will eventually be shapes of some kind in here. But most of it is, the hard or sharper edges of all the shapes, the really dark values. You can see I've compressed basically from most of this really dark value into that obviously lighter value in the cheek. And as I go forward, what I'll do is darken this whole thing and then just continue to darken this bottom part to push that value darker and darker over here. But I won't think, it'll be easier to not think of them separately and kind of put in my values more holistically, because all I really need to do is darken that after I go forward. And if I can compress those all together and then just lift up maybe a little bit in that cheek where it gets slightly lighter, I'll already have a lot of the work done for the nuance in this shadow. Versus drawing this separately and then drawing this separately and trying to model those. Oftentimes you'll get like a seam line where those two shapes butt up against each other, and it'll cause it to look a little less joined together, a little less smooth in terms of the transition from these shapes to each other. That's fine for areas like in the eye, where that light shape is very different from the dark shape. To draw these two areas separately, this dark value and this kind of lighter value, because that shape is so separate from that shadow. But areas where they're running into each other much smoother, it's easier to kind of join or corral those all together and then just push your darks darker.